first hours. The thermometer that changed everything. It begins before dawn. Somewhere over the sun-baked expanse of the Mojave Desert, a mass of air so superheated it shimmers like liquid glass pushes eastward across the American continent. By 6 in the morning, weather stations from Phoenix to Dallas are already recording 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun has barely cleared the horizon. This is not a heat wave. This is not a record-breaking summer afternoon. This is the new permanent condition of planet Earth, and within the next 24 hours, every living system on this planet will begin to feel its consequences. The thermometer will not fall tonight. It will not fall tomorrow night. It will never meaningfully fall again. In Phoenix, where summer temperatures already flirt with 115 degrees Fahrenheit on the worst days, residents might initially assume this is simply another brutal afternoon. But something feels different. The air itself seems to resist breathing, thick with a density that presses against the lungs. The wet bulb temperature, the true measure of the human body's ability to cool itself through sweat, climbs past the critical threshold of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. At that level, even a healthy adult sitting motionless in the shade will begin to accumulate heat faster than their body can shed it. Emergency rooms across Phoenix receive their first heat-related admissions by 9 in the morning. In New York City, home to 8.5 million people packed across 5 boroughs, the concrete canyons of Manhattan trap radiant heat like an oven with its door sealed shut. The asphalt on Broadway softens. Metal expansion joints on the Brooklyn Bridge creak and groan as steel expands at a rate engineers designed for only the hottest summer afternoons, not sustained temperatures of 113 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. Central Park, usually a green refuge, turns silent. Birds disappear from the sky. Squirrels retreat deep into whatever shade remains. The park's surface soil, measured at just 2 inches deep in many areas, reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. By late afternoon on this first extraordinary day, power grids across the continental United States are straining under a demand load that engineers model only as a catastrophic scenario. Air conditioning units in Los Angeles alone draw enough electricity to power the entire state of Nevada under normal conditions. Transformers in Chicago overheat and fail. Rolling blackouts begin in San Antonio before sunset. The first hours of this new world have already made one thing catastrophically clear. Human civilization was built for a planet that no longer exists. First weeks. The infrastructure breaks. 14 days into a permanent 113 degree Fahrenheit reality, and the United States is no longer functioning as a unified country. It is functioning as dozens of isolated crisis zones, each struggling to maintain the basic systems that 330 million people depend upon for survival. The power grid, that invisible nervous system of modern life, was designed with generous tolerances, but not for this. Sustained heat causes resistance in transmission lines to increase, reducing their capacity by as much as 20%. Transformers, which were already aging infrastructure before this crisis began, fail at triple their normal rate. By day 10, 17 states experience daily blackouts lasting between 6 and 14 hours. Without reliable electricity, the cascade of failures accelerates with terrible logic. Water treatment plants in Houston, which processes over 200 million gallons of drinking water every day, require continuous power to run their pumps and filtration systems. When power fails for 6 hours, pressure in the water mains drops below the threshold needed to prevent contamination from entering the pipes. Boil water advisories go out to 4 million residents who have no reliable means to boil anything. Grocery store refrigeration fails. Across Dallas, roughly 40% of all perishable food in commercial cold storage becomes unsafe to eat within 72 hours of the first major blackout. The food supply chain, already stressed, begins to fracture. Transportation collapses in ways that feel both sudden and inevitable. Asphalt is a petroleum product, with a melting point that varies depending on its composition, but sustained surface temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit cause road surfaces across the Sunbelt to rut, buckle, and deform under vehicle weight. Interstate 10 between Los Angeles and San Diego develops tire-swallowing ruts within 10 days. Rail networks face equally severe problems. Steel rails expand roughly 0.03 of an inch per foot for every 18 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature increase. The result is track buckling, called sun kinks by engineers, which derails trains and forces shutdowns on nearly a third of the freight rail network east of the Mississippi River by day 18. Human bodies become the most immediate crisis of all. Hospitals across the nation are overwhelmed within the first week. The elderly, the very young, outdoor workers, and anyone without air conditioning represent a population of tens of millions who face life-threatening heat exposure every single day. The Centers for Disease Control would later model that. In these first weeks, the United States experiences heat-related deaths at a rate not seen since the great epidemics of the 19th century, averaging roughly 40,000 fatalities per week across the country as systems struggle to respond. First year, a continent transformed. 12 months into permanent 113 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, and the word before has taken on the weight of a historical epoch. Before the heat, Americans will say, the way earlier generations once said before the war. The nation that existed a year ago, with its outdoor farmers markets and morning jogs and children playing in city parks during summer, feels as remote as the 19th century. What has replaced it is something harder, more deliberate, and profoundly constrained. Human life in America has not ended, but it has been compressed into something drastically smaller in its daily scope and ambition. The agricultural system of the United States, which feeds not just 330 million Americans, but also contributes enormously to global food exports, has suffered catastrophic losses. The Corn Belt of the Midwest, stretching across Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, depends on temperatures that allow crops to complete their growing cycles without heat stress. Corn begins experiencing irreversible yield damage at sustained temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. At 113 degrees, the growing season that once defined American agricultural abundance becomes essentially impossible without extreme intervention. Crop failures across the Corn Belt reach between 70 and 80% in this first year, representing a loss of roughly 13 billion bushels of corn that the global food system was counting on. Water is now the organizing principle of all survival. The Colorado River system, which already faced severe overallocation before this crisis, supplies water to over 40 million people across 7 states and is losing roughly 4 feet of depth from Lake Mead every month through evaporation under sustained extreme heat. The Hoover Dam, that monument to American engineering confidence, still stands as imposing as ever at 726 feet tall, but the water behind it has dropped to levels that threaten its ability to generate hydroelectric power. Lake Mead, by the end of year 1, sits at 31% capacity, and engineers calculate that at current evaporation rates, power generation will cease within another 18 months. Migration has already begun reshaping the American demographic map. Cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and San Antonio, which were among the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the country just 2 years ago, are experiencing population outflows of unprecedented speed. Phoenix loses nearly 400,000 residents in this first year alone, its population dropping from roughly 5 million to below 4.5 million as people move northward and toward coastal areas where ocean breezes offer marginally cooler conditions. The great internal migration of American history, from the Dust Bowl to the Great Migration, finds its most dramatic echo yet. Years 1 to 10. The Great Sorting. The first decade reshapes American civilization along lines no political map ever anticipated. It is not a collapse, exactly, though that word gets used often in the headlines that still manage to reach people through intermittent internet connections. It is more accurately described as a profound sorting, a reorganization of where and how human beings can sustain life on a continent whose climate has been irrevocably transformed. Cities that once seemed permanent as mountains are being evaluated purely on the cold mathematics of survival. Can you keep people cool enough? Can you feed them? Can you get water to them? The answers determine everything. The Pacific Northwest becomes the most contested real estate on the continent. Seattle, where temperatures remain 5 to 8 degrees cooler than the national average due to maritime influence from Puget Sound, grows from roughly 4 million in its metropolitan area to nearly 11 million within 8 years. The city cannot build fast enough. Underground infrastructure, that invisible skeleton of pipes and tunnels and cables, simply cannot be expanded at the pace human bodies are arriving. The Space Needle, once a symbol of futuristic optimism, now overlooks a city struggling with all the urgency and chaos of a frontier settlement. San Francisco similarly becomes almost impossibly crowded, its famous fog, now more precious than gold, providing natural cooling that reduces surface temperatures by 15 degrees compared to the inland valleys. Meanwhile, the cities left behind enter a process that urban planners call managed decline, but that feels, to those remaining, like abandonment. Chicago, despite sitting on the edge of Lake Michigan with its enormous thermal buffering capacity, sees its population fall from 2.5 million to under 1 million as the heat proves too punishing for sustained outdoor work and the city's aging infrastructure fails repeatedly. The Willis Tower, one of the tallest buildings in the Western Hemisphere at 1,450 feet, develops serious structural concerns as repeated thermal cycling causes metal fatigue in its exterior frame. By year 7, its upper 30 floors are evacuated and closed permanently. The economy has been restructured entirely around 3 priorities: cooling, water, and food. Solar panel manufacturing becomes the largest industry in America by year 4, not for environmental reasons, but for pure survival, as electricity for air conditioning represents the difference between life and death. The Mojave and Sonoran deserts, now emptied of almost all human habitation, become the most productive energy-generating territories on the planet. Vast solar farms covering areas the size of Connecticut capture the relentless energy of an unforgiving sun and transmit it north and east to the population centers struggling to remain habitable. Years 10 to 50, the long reckoning, 4 decades into permanent extreme heat, and the generation of Americans who remember the before world has begun to pass into old age. Their children, born into a world where going outside between 8 in the morning and 7 in the evening means risking death, have grown up with a completely different understanding of what normal means. They do not grieve the lost outdoor cafes and baseball games the way their parents do. For them, the sealed underground corridors connecting buildings in Chicago, the nocturnal schedules of Houston, where all commerce and movement happens between 10 at night and 4 in the morning, and the elaborate water rationing systems that govern daily life are simply the world as it is. Adaptation, that most human of capacities, has done its extraordinary work. By year 25, roughly 60% of the continental United States south of the 40th parallel, a line running approximately through Denver, Indianapolis, and Philadelphia, is functionally uninhabitable during daylight hours without mechanical cooling. The population distribution of the nation has inverted from its 20th century patterns. The Sun Belt, that great engine of American growth from the 1960s onward, is now largely empty. Houston, once the 4th largest city in America, with a population approaching 3 million, has dwindled to under 200,000. A skeleton crew of engineers maintaining the petroleum and chemical infrastructure that the remaining nation still depends upon, rotating in and out on 30-day shifts like workers on an offshore oil platform. The natural world is undergoing transformations of equal magnitude. The great forests of the eastern United States, from the Green Mountains of Vermont to the Appalachians of Virginia, are dying from the bottom up. Trees are fundamentally water management systems, drawing moisture from the soil and releasing it through their leaves in a process called transpiration. At sustained temperatures of 113 degrees Fahrenheit, the rate of transpiration exceeds what root systems can supply from increasingly depleted soils. Forests that took centuries to establish are dying across millions of acres. In their place, drought-resistant scrub vegetation and invasive species adapted to desert conditions are moving northward at rates ecologists describe as the fastest documented vegetation shift in the geological record outside of mass extinction events. The core, Mississippi River, which drains 31 states and carries roughly 580 billion gallons of water to the Gulf of Mexico in a normal year, is running at roughly 40% of its historical average flow by year 40. Barge traffic on the river, which once carried over 500 million tons of cargo annually, has been reduced to near zero at certain stretches during what used to be called summer months. The great inland waterway that Abraham Lincoln once called the backbone of the nation is becoming a seasonal trickle in its southern reaches, fundamentally altering the agricultural and industrial geography of the continent. Years 50 to 100, the end of familiar America. By the midpoint of this first century, the United States of America still exists as a legal and political entity, but it would be unrecognizable to anyone transported from the previous century. Its center of gravity has shifted dramatically northward. The capital, Washington, D.C., was officially moved to Minneapolis in year 37, making it the first relocation of the American seat of government since the city's founding. Minneapolis sits close enough to the Canadian border and the moderating influence of the Great Lakes to maintain year-round habitability, though its population of nearly 7 million strains infrastructure designed for a fraction of that number. The old monuments of Washington, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the White House still stand, maintained by a small caretaker staff, ghostly monuments to a civilization organized around a climate that no longer exists. The Statue of Liberty remains standing in New York Harbor, though the harbor itself has been transformed. Sea levels, responding to the accelerated melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, driven by sustained global temperatures far above any historical precedent, have risen approximately 4 feet above their early 21st century levels by year 70. Approximately 30% of Lower Manhattan now floods regularly during high tide events. The financial district, that dense cluster of towers where so much of American economic activity was once orchestrated, operates at perhaps 15% of its former capacity. Its ground floors permanently sealed against water intrusion, its upper floors cooled at enormous energy expense for the workers who rotate through on compressed schedules. The human population of the United States has fallen to approximately 190 million by year 100, down from its peak of roughly 340 million. This represents not primarily a death toll, though heat-related mortality has been significant and sustained, but rather an extraordinary emigration. Canada, whose subarctic interior has paradoxically become one of the most desirable territories on Earth, as permafrost melts to reveal arable land, has absorbed over 60 million former Americans. The border between the two nations, once the longest peaceful international boundary in the world at 5,500 miles, has become one of the most significant demographic frontiers in human history, with tent cities and processing centers stretching for hundreds of miles. Nature itself is barely recognizable. The Everglades of Florida, that extraordinary river of grass covering 4,000 square miles at its peak, has essentially ceased to exist as a functioning ecosystem by year 90. In its place, a salt-flat and scrubland ecosystem resembling the coastal deserts of Baja California has established itself. The American alligator, one of the most resilient large reptiles on Earth, has survived, but its range has compressed northward into Georgia and the Carolinas, where it competes with invasive species arriving from Central America as that region becomes too hot, even for organisms evolved for tropical heat. Years 100 to 500. The new continent. 4 centuries into this relentless thermal transformation, and the word America applies now to a geography that has been fundamentally restructured by forces operating far beyond human control. The political entity of the United States has fragmented and reconfigured multiple times. What remains coheres around the Great Lakes Basin and the northern tier of states, a civilization of roughly 60 million people who have developed extraordinarily sophisticated underground and climate-controlled architecture. Cities exist primarily below grade, with surface structures reserved for energy collection and agriculture, conducted under vast reflective canopies that reduce ground-level temperatures by as much as 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The Golden Gate Bridge still stands at year 200, a remarkable testament to the engineering precision of its original builders, who drove its towers 110 feet into the bedrock of San Francisco Bay. The bay itself has expanded significantly as sea levels have risen, roughly 12 feet above early 21st century baselines. The bridge's foundations remain secure, but its roadway is pitted and weathered beyond any practical use, its famous international orange paint long since scoured away by decades of chemical-laden precipitation. It stands as the ancient Romans might have stood before the aqueducts of a predecessor civilization, marveling at permanence, divorced entirely from function. The biological world has been remade. The great mammalian megafauna of North America, the white-tailed deer, the black bear, the gray wolf, whose populations had recovered so dramatically during the conservation movements of the late 20th century, have largely retreated or perished. Species with short generation times and broad thermal tolerances have thrived. Insects, particularly cockroach species, certain ant genera, and heat-adapted beetle species, have diversified dramatically. Reptiles dominate the southern three-quarters of the continent in a way that has no parallel in the last 65 million years of Earth history. The descendants of Burmese pythons introduced to Florida in the late 20th century have expanded their range as far north as the former location of Chicago by year 300, a population of enormous, heat-adapted constrictors occupying the ruins of what was once the third largest city in America. Ocean chemistry has shifted profoundly. The Gulf of Mexico, that warm, shallow body of water that once hosted extraordinary biodiversity and a multi-billion-dollar fishing industry, now reaches surface temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit during what had been summer months. At these temperatures, most coral organisms die immediately, most fish species cannot survive, and the waters host instead extreme thermophile bacterial mats and jellyfish populations of extraordinary density. The shrimping industry, the oyster beds, the redfish and speckled trout, the entire living economy of the Gulf is memory. What replaces it is alien to any marine biologist trained before this transformation began. Years 500 to 1000, the world after us. At the half-millennium mark, the architectural legacy of human civilization is everywhere present and everywhere decaying. The great structures Americans once built to last forever are proving their builders were both more and less correct than they imagined. More correct in that steel-reinforced concrete structures of sufficient mass resist simple weathering for centuries beyond what their designers anticipated. less correct in that no one anticipated the specific chemistry of a superheated atmosphere interacting with their materials across geological timescales. The Empire State Building, 1,454 feet of Art Deco limestone and steel, still rises above the flooded streets of Lower Manhattan at year 500, though its upper floors have lost their window glazing entirely, making it an open-air vertical ruin of extraordinary scale and strange beauty. The Hoover Dam presents a different kind of monument. Lake Mead emptied completely by year 140, its waters lost to evaporation and diversion before natural replenishment could replace them. The Colorado River, reduced to a seasonal trickle by year 200, no longer delivers meaningful flow to the reservoir. The dam itself, 726 feet of concrete so dense it took 5 years and 40 million cubic feet of material to build, stands in a dry canyon surrounded by sediment. Structurally, it remains essentially sound, a monument to a moment when human beings believed they could command rivers as permanent and purposeless as a pyramid. The human population occupying what was once the continental United States has stabilized at somewhere between 15 and 20 million people, concentrated almost entirely in the most northerly latitudes and in subterranean complexes that use geothermal and nuclear energy for climate control. These communities are technologically sophisticated in narrow ways, expert at energy harvesting and water reclamation, but far smaller in their ambitions than the civilization that preceded them. They tell stories about the old world, the way medieval Europeans told stories about Rome, with a mixture of reverence, incomprehension, and quiet pride that they have survived where so many others could not. Mount Rushmore stands almost unchanged, carved 60 feet into the granite of the Black Hills of South Dakota. The faces of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln endure with remarkable fidelity. The granite from which they were carved is one of the most durable materials on the surface of the earth, resistant to all but the most aggressive chemical weathering. By year 1000, only the finest surface details have been lost. The precise curl of a lip, the exact line of an eyelid. The broad forms remain, 4 faces looking out across a continent those men could not have imagined, testifying to a civilization as remote from whatever comes next as ancient Mesopotamia is from modern New York. Years 1000 to 10,000, deep time and new life. 1,000 years of sustained 113-degree daily temperatures have accomplished something that no geologist would have thought possible on a human timescale. They have begun to visibly alter the physical landscape of the continent. The process is not dramatic in the way of earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. It is patient and inexorable, the way water cutting through rock is patient and inexorable. But its cumulative effect at the 1,000-year mark is beginning to register in measurements that would have astonished the scientists of the previous era. Thermal expansion and contraction of surface rock, cycling through extreme temperatures daily for a millennium, has accelerated physical weathering rates across exposed bedrock surfaces by a factor of roughly 8 compared to pre-crisis norms. Mountain surfaces that once eroded at a rate of fractions of an inch per century are now measurably changing on timescales of decades. The evolutionary record is already being written in real time, though no human observer alive today could read it fully. Evolution moves slowly when measured against human lifespans, but 10,000 years represents approximately 500 generations for a large mammal, and thousands of generations for insects and microorganisms. The organisms that survive in a 113-degree world are not simply the same species enduring difficult conditions. They are populations that have been under extraordinary selective pressure for dozens to hundreds of generations, and the genetic shifts accumulating in those populations represent the raw material of new species. Certain rodent lineages in the northern settlements show physiological changes in thermoregulation that biologists classify as subspecies. Level divergence by year 3000. By year 8000, they are debating whether full species status is appropriate. The ocean's chemistry has reached a new equilibrium, though equilibrium is a word that implies stability, where what exists is more accurately a dynamic new state, unlike anything in the last 50 million years of Earth history. Ocean temperatures have risen an average of 11 degrees Fahrenheit above their pre-crisis baselines. The thermocline, that invisible boundary layer between warm surface water and cold deep water, has deepened and diffused across most of the world's ocean basins. The circulation patterns that once moved heat and nutrients around the globe, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the Pacific gyre systems, have been fundamentally reorganized. Monsoon systems have shifted hundreds of miles from their historical positions. The geological signature of this era will be legible to scientists living 10 million years from now. They will find a layer in the sedimentary record, thin but chemically distinctive, marked by a sudden increase in certain organic compounds released by decomposing organic matter, a spike in carbonate dissolution products from ocean acidification, and a characteristic pattern of terrestrial erosion that tells a clear story. They will look at this layer and recognize it for what it is, the mark of a civilization that burned its way through a geological epoch in the span of a few centuries, and then endured the consequences for millennia. Final reflection. What survives the heat? Stand at the edge of what was once Chicago, on the remains of the waterfront where Lake Michigan still glitters under a sun that never relents, and consider the full sweep of what a single number, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, every day, without exception, means for a planet and its inhabitants. The question this scenario poses is not really about temperature. It is about resilience, adaptation, loss, and the stubborn persistence of life in forms that defy the imagination of those who came before. The story of permanent extreme heat on Earth is not a story of total extinction. It is something more complicated, and, in its own strange way, more instructive than that. What survives is extraordinary. Life, in its microbial and insect and reptilian expressions, is essentially unkillable at these temperatures. The planet has been hotter before, during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, roughly 56 million years ago, when global average temperatures briefly spiked by as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Life did not end. It reorganized. It migrated. It evolved. The Earth we are imagining in this scenario is extreme, even by geological standards, but the biosphere's fundamental drive toward complexity and diversity does not switch off. What switches off is the particular arrangement of life that produced human civilization as we know it, and that is the loss that echoes through every section of this story. The American structures that appear throughout this narrative, the Statue of Liberty standing in a rising harbor, Mount Rushmore enduring on its granite hillside, the Hoover Dam presiding over an empty reservoir, serve as more than dramatic props. They are measuring sticks. They tell us how long human works persist after the conditions that produce them have vanished. The answer is both humbling and somehow encouraging. Centuries in many cases. The physical evidence of a civilization outlasts the civilization itself by enormous margins. What does not persist is the living human context that gave those structures meaning. Perhaps the most important thing this thought experiment teaches is not about temperature at all. It is about the extraordinary narrowness of the conditions that allow complex human civilization to function. A difference of 35 degrees Fahrenheit between the temperatures we evolved under and the permanent heat of this scenario is enough to collapse the agricultural systems, water systems, energy systems, and social systems that support billions of people. We built everything we have within a specific climatic envelope, and that envelope is not infinitely elastic. The real question this scenario leaves behind, hanging in air far too hot to breathe, is not what would happen if it got this hot. The real question is how much smaller a change would be enough to begin the unraveling, and whether we are paying sufficient attention to the thermometer while we still have time to read it.